Well, thanks very much for waiting, for your tolerance. And can everyone hear okay? Are you happy with the sound? Sound level? Brilliant, after all that. Thanks very much to Caroline for introducing us and then having to disappear. Thanks very particularly to Melanie Unwin, who's made tonight happen. Without her, we wouldn't be here. And it's very nice to be able to share the priming of the conversation with Elizabeth Crawford, who I've enjoyed working with on this research, and with Pat, who's been very helpful on the welfare roots of the book. Emily Wilding Davison already mentioned, and she remains the best known, celebrated of the evaders. But let's just think of who else there was. There was mass evasions in big cities across the country. The biggest, Elizabeth will talk about at the Aldwych, just down the other end of the Strand. And in Manchester, Census Lodge, where there were over 200 evaders and 88 overspill round the corner. So the length and breadth of the country, from Cornwall up to Newcastle, the boycott took place. And it so captured the public imagination in spring 1911 that for the Edwardians that meant a comic postcard. It's here, sadly rather small, but perhaps you could have a look at it afterwards. And we so liked it, we've used it for the cover of the book. And what it is, of course, if you can just about see, it's a ballooning image. And I'm not sure that any census evaders, did actually avoid the census enumerator by setting sail in a balloon. It's nice to think that they did, but I'm not sure that Elizabeth and I, so far, assiduous though we are, have found any balloonists. And what it refers back to, of course, is the wonderful, exotic Australian actress, Muriel Matters, who set sail over London in an airship exactly 2 years earlier, distributing her suffrage handbills to the people below. And it suggests to us, the comic postcard, how much the boycott captured the public imagination. But tonight, our focus moves beyond the most celebrated of the census boycotters, from the celebrated few to the lesser known many. Because if a household census was anything, it was uncompromisingly egalitarian. Each person alive on census night, 1911, counted equally. It didn't matter whether you were a suffrage dowager in Belsize Park, living in 18 rooms with your family and 5 domestic servants. Anyone recognise Lady Strachey there? Yep. Or a bootmaker's wife in Stockport in Cheshire, a family of 7 squashed into 6 rooms. Jenny Baines, the suffragette, they both counted equally. They both wanted the same amount of space on the census schedule or form. And that's what makes the census so very interesting. And boycotters pop up from the middle of nowhere, names that even Elizabeth and I didn't really know before. And there are other surprises as well. What Elizabeth and I discovered was that suffragettes who we thought might have evaded, might have boycotted the census, actually complied and handed over a completely accurate schedule to the census enumerator who came to collect them. Why? Why did they? What we found is we needed to look at the arguments of spring 1911, arguments for boycotting, for complying, that were raging across the country in that spring. What kind of arguments? Well, behind the census lay the towering welfare ambitions of Asquith's Liberal government. And fizzing out of the Treasury, fizzing out of number 11, were the ideas of Lloyd George, of course, and particularly his immensely ambitious National Insurance Bill. And what that bill and similar legislation wanted was to be based on accurate information. To improve the conditions for women and children in the future, they needed to have, they reckoned, accurate census data, and Pat's going to talk about that, I think.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the background to the census and what it was all about. Of course, the main purpose of the census, like every other census every 10 years since 1801, was to count the population. But like other censuses, it asked some specific questions that related to concerns of the government of the day. And no doubt many suffrage campaigners would have boycotted it on principle, as we've heard, no matter what questions it asked. But this census had some special features of particular interest to many women, inclining some of them to be more hostile to it, but others rather less. For the first time, it asked how many children had been born to each marriage, and how many of these children had died. And underlying this was a concern that had been growing since the 1870s, that the national birth rate was falling. Having previously been exceptionally high, it was still falling steadily by 1911, and then carried on falling till the early 1930s. At the same time, levels of infant and child mortality were high. And this caused a certain panic, particularly because by the later 19th century, Britain was starting to face competition from other countries after decades in which it had been the leading industrial nation, the workshop of the world, the first to industrialise, and internationally politically powerful and with a large empire. But by the end of the century, it was facing competition from emerging economies, particularly Germany and the United States, and also greater political and potentially military competition, particularly from Germany. And some associated this relative international decline with the falling birth rate, seeing that as a sign of declining national virility and the weakening physical condition of the British population compared with her rivals. And the problem, and its causes, are widely debated. Many people thought the birth rate was falling fastest among the middle classes, who, being cautious, careful people who plan their lives, were restricting births in order to raise family living standards, while the feckless masses, of course, were thoughtlessly having more children than they can afford, who were growing up malnourished and physically feeble, and causing national physical degeneration due to their greater numbers compared with the dwindling middle classes. So the physical state of the national stock was degenerating. And of course, this was a time when ideas of eugenics were developed, the belief that physical and mental characteristics were determined by inheritance, by one's genes. Though it must be said, eugenics was never overwhelmingly influential in this country. Always far more important were environmentalist reform ideas, the belief that human defects were due to poverty, overcrowding, poor sanitation, conditions that were very common in the growing cities, but could be remedied by cleaning up the towns, providing more work, better housing, better services. The ideas that lay behind the emerging welfare state that begins in the early years of the 20th century. And while this debate was in progress in 1899, along came the Burr War, the war in South Africa, initiated by farmers of Dutch origin who didn't want to be absorbed into the British Empire. And challenges to the British Empire weren't new, but this time it took 3 years for the mighty British Imperial Army to vanquish a group of relatively untrained farmers. And this was taken as another sign of British national decline. All the more so because leading military men deflected criticism of their leadership by blaming the poor physical condition of volunteers for the army. Many of them had had to be turned away because they weren't fit enough to fight. In fact, the same problem of physically unfit volunteers had emerged during the Crimean War, but there hadn't been such a crisis then, so people didn't make such a fuss about it. But this time, the experience of the war added to the general moral panic caused by the falling birth rate and the high infant mortality rate. The infant mortality rate was actually falling, but it was still high. In the 1870s, 152 babies died out of every 1,000 born in England and Wales. By 1911, it had gone down to 112 in 1,000. So it was going down, but it was still a lot. And again, the mortality rate was presented as an indicator of national physical weakness. And of course, one way to minimise the effect of fewer babies being born was to stop so many babies dying. And of course, around this time also, at the turn of the century, there were major social surveys by Charles Booth and Sibo Murray showing high levels of severe poverty, affecting up to 30% of the population. So the government felt concerned enough to set up an investigation called the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration to investigate the physical state of the nation, especially of children, the nation's future, to try to work out whether conditions were getting worse, and if so, what could be done about it. And this committee reported in 1904 and concluded there was no evidence of actual deterioration. Doctors actually insisted on this, and also that poor health wasn't hereditary. But they did agree that too many people, including children, especially poor people, were undernourished and physically unfit. And the report recommended improved regulation of the environment, control of overcrowding and pollution, more open spaces, better distribution of low-cost food and milk, especially to babies and children, the training of mothers in childcare and nutrition, and girls in cookery, and physical exercise should be encouraged. And there should be regular medical inspection in schools and school meals. Then in 1906, a Liberal government was elected, which became very committed to social reform. As we've heard from Jill, it later introduced national health insurance, also the first state pensions. In fact, among its earliest actions was the introduction of free school meals for poor school children and medical inspection in all state schools. These were actually Labour measures that some of the early Labour MPs put forward, but supported by the Liberals. At the same time, in the early years of the 20th century, there was another important movement of women campaigning for more action to help mothers and children in order to improve health and reduce death rates. Many of these women were also suffrage campaigners. One of the many reasons why they wanted the vote was to make Parliament improve social conditions like this, conditions that male voters and MPs had neglected for so long. So organisations like the large Working Class Women's Cooperative Guild and Women in the Labour Party and many other women of all classes particularly campaigned for maternal and child welfare clinics where mothers could get free medical advice, which most working class women couldn't afford, and get advice on diet and child rearing, and help to breastfeed, and free or cheap access to unpolluted milk. Also, they wanted health visitors to be appointed to visit women in their own homes. And they've set up voluntary clinics themselves. The Women's Co-op Guild published a series of letters from working women describing their lives, and an example of one of them is behind. You may not be able to read. A woman who wrote that, "I've had 9 children, 7 born in 9 years, 1 stillbirth, 1 miscarriage. I've only 1 now. The others have died from weakness at birth. My husband had a small wage. I can truthfully say my children have died of insufficient food. For many of my children, I've not been able to pay a nurse to look after me," and that's a very typical story. So the 1911 census was set up against this background. The government and civil servants wanted to use the census to add to their knowledge of what was happening to the state of the population, including the birth and child death rates, to guide them towards measures that would improve things. And they particularly wanted to know which sections of the population was responsible for the falling birth rate. Was it just the responsible, respectable middle classes? And whose children were dying? So for the first time, this census asked every household to list whether every household member over age 15 who was present on census night was married, widowed, or single. And again, you won't be able to see it, but the census questions are here behind me. How long each marriage had lasted, how many children had been born to each marriage, and how many had died. Some women and men found these questions intrusive and in themselves a reason to resist the census, though not necessarily the only reason. But other women campaigners for improved welfare for women and children must have felt more conflicted. On one hand, they approved of the state getting better informed in order to provide better services. On the other hand, as suffrage campaigners, they didn't want to be counted when, as we've heard, they did not count. So, as we heard, and we'll hear more from Elizabeth, they resisted the census.
Yes, so all those census forms, all those householders' forms that had been filled out on the 2nd of April 1911 sat unremarked for not quite 100 years, because actually the census was released slightly early in January 2009, rather than having to wait right into 2011. And Jill and I had both been very interested in looking at it when it did come out, and so we, as soon as it was released, we set to finding out what we could from it. And it's difficult now, looking back, to remember how relatively restricted access to those census forms. I mean, that's only, about 5 years ago. But when they came out, the information was only released piecemeal, county by county. And because it was then rather expensive accessing the website, we had to go over to Kew, to the National Archives, where you could look at it for free. So all amongst all their family historians looking into their family histories, we set to trying to find out what had happened to the suffragette boycott. We'd read all the various accounts in Votes for Women, the suffragette newspapers, and the Women's Freedom League paper, and we'd read biographies and autobiographies, and about the census would sometimes be mentioned, and it would be usually claimed that hundreds of thousands of women had boycotted. So we thought, well, we must try and find out what had really happened. Now, from the comfort of your own home, you can easily access the census on the two genealogy sites, either Ancestry or Find My Past, and each of which has its own particular strengths. And it's useful to bear in mind that the census actually consisted of two sets of papers, the forms themselves and the enumerator's summary books, into which the enumerator then transferred in an edited form the data he collected. When we began the research, we wanted to see if it was possible to gauge how successful the call to the boycott, the call to boycott the census had been. I mean, that's the very simplest approach, and to do that, we needed to find the census returns on which suffragettes had visibly registered a protest and refused to give information. So to begin our search, we needed basic biographical details, because you have to feed a search engine with the most basic information to get anything out of it. So we actually used it as my women's suffrage reference book, because that gives birth dates and addresses, both of which are very useful. Just trying to find the people, and then when you do find them, trying to make sure that you've got the right person, the right Mary Brown or whatever. And we used that and the Suffrage Annual and Women's Who's Who, which had been published in 1913, and will give a good indication of people who were involved in the suffrage movement at the time. Although it was only really the WSPU and the Women's Freedom League who were prepared to take up the call to the boycott, and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, on the whole, its members didn't. And in fact, the Suffrage Annual mainly consists of NUWSS members, so there are not so many in that. Using this basic information from the reference guide, we did find a good number of resistors straight away, and out came the forms with no vote, no census, and women don't count, so we won't be counted, etc., all written across them in various quite florid handwriting and quite intimate riposte to the government. So these were resistors, those who'd heeded the boycott and returned protesting forms. And then there were another lot of women one might be able to identify, those who just weren't at home on census night, and that was where it was useful, obviously, if you had an address. And then you would find that they weren't anywhere else. And if they had a reasonably unusual name, I mean, you could see that there's nowhere that they were. And you could call those the evaders. So there are two groups, the resistors and the evaders. However, it was then necessary to think of other ways of winkling out more resistors and invaders. These were the unknowns, the ones whose names we didn't know. And they were doubly hidden from history simply because their names and association to the suffrage movement hadn't yet been remarked. I mean, they may lie their letters to Votes for Women or the vote, but they weren't easily available in secondary texts. And then there were also those, they were doubly hidden because they were also hidden from the census enumerator and hence from us, just by their own action on the night of the 2nd of April 1911. So as I mentioned, each of these sites, Find My Past and Ancestry, offer different facilities, and on Ancestry you can use a keyword search and you can put in suffragette or information denied or no vote or any other such variation you could think of and just see what turns up. And we added a good number of names that way. However, to achieve these results, you do have to be prepared to wade through a large number of census returns where information was refused for reasons other than for Votes for Women, and you see various forms where obviously a couple perhaps don't want to be seen together in a hotel on a certain night, and I often thought there was plenty of plots for novels in these census forms. Another way I found of trying to trick the search engine into delivering up the kind of information we were looking for was very simply to key in Miss or Mrs. as the first name. And I mean, if you just put it as a first name into a search box and see what comes up, because often the householder would only have written no vote, no census or something like that. But the census enumerator would then have gone to the neighbours and he'd have found out that the name was, say, for instance, in this case, Rogers, because we found an address in Bristol, in Clifton, for a Mr. Rogers, whose wife, 2 daughters and servant weren't there, but the enumerator said they were, but Mr. Rogers had written across the form, no one occupied this house during the time specified. But the enumerator had identified them as suffragettes and had obviously gone to the neighbours and got more details. But he, as you'll see from the gazetteer at the back of Vanishing for the Vote, was the secretary of the local branch of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in Bristol. And Jill has found from Mary Blathwaite's so useful diary that Mrs. Rogers had gone over from Bristol to take part in a mass evasion in Bath, and she'd even given a recitation during the course of the evening. So there's more behind this census form that says no one occupied the house on that night. And also, so you can't necessarily believe, because people are said to be away, you can't necessarily believe that they were on holiday. They might well have been evading, so we had to do various other pieces of research on individuals. And then the other site, Find My Past, allows you to search by an address, and that was useful in uncovering households where the wife should have been present on census night, but wasn't, and wasn't anywhere else. And if she was, for instance, branch secretary of the Women's Freedom League, and during the course of March 1911 had been out holding meetings saying boycott the census, if she wasn't home on census night, there was a pretty strong presumption she was what we call a missing wife. And she was taking part in a mass evasion or sheltering in another household where her name wasn't recorded. For instance, in Peckham, there's Mrs. Julia Pickering, a member of the Women's Freedom League, was not at home on census night, and her husband, Herbert, didn't know her whereabouts and wasn't able to tell the enumerator how old she was. So Ancestry, the other site, has proved very useful in allowing one to browse right through the enumerator's summary books. I mean, these look rather off-putting at the time, but the dedicated researcher just gets on with it. And these pages prove helpful in areas such as Hampstead Gardens suburb, where the enumerator had very helpfully circled any household where information had been withheld. So looking through this, we're able to pick up protesters quite easily that we'd not previously known about, such as Dr. Letitia Fairfield, who was the sister of Rebecca West. And in addition, the summary books have been particularly useful in uncovering one particular type of form, those returned for premises that hosted the mass evasions. For even when we had an address for, say, the WSPU office at which Votes for Women reported a census party had been held, there seemed to be no form associated with the address. And I eventually worked out these forms, it's all rather technical, were held at the back of the book that covered the appropriate registration district, and not within the regular sequence of forms which are arranged by street. And the forms at the back of the book included not only suffrage census parties, but other reports made by the police, such as those for vagrants. And actually it's still not that easy to identify where these forms may lie. And I did get a speedy new computer a few months ago and did manage to uncover quite a few more of these mass evasions, and I've put various of the stories behind them up on my website, which is called Woman and Her Sphere. There were evasions, for instance, in very publicised in Votes for Women in Gillingham and in Birmingham, and so I managed to find out about those, but there may well be others that are still awaiting discovery. But it was in the census summary book that we last found the form relating to the major anti-census protests, which is the one you see behind me, at the Aldwych skating rink. This received a great deal of publicity at the time, right there in central London. But for ages we couldn't find a census form related to it, and we didn't actually even know whether there was a census form, and didn't know where the rink was. In the contemporary papers, of course, they just referred to it as the Aldwych skating rink, as though everybody would know where it was. But after some research, I found that it was on the northeastern curve of Aldwych, just to the east of Houghton Street, and it's very much now LSE territory and just a stone's throw from the Women's Library. And at that time there were no other buildings there, all those big imperial buildings that we think of in Aldwych and Kingsway, very few of them had yet been built, and the whole area was mainly hoardings around vacant plots. But there was this skating rink, which was a sort of chalet type building, and it was very close to it. It sort of butted onto the rear of the WSPU headquarters at Clement's Inn, and was just along the Strand from the Women's Freedom League offices. And so what more suitable venue to book for your census party? And so it wasn't just that skating was popular, it was really just that the space was so close and large and easy. And also the rinkeries was not a profitable business, I discovered, and it was just about to go bust, in fact. And doubtless the owner was very pleased to have the night's rent and wasn't too worried about the police being all around. But so then, knowing where the building was, I was actually able then to find the census form, which is there. You can see it there. And it was at the back of the book, of this summary book, amongst all the vagrants who were sleeping in the open in St Clement's Lane. And the form recorded that 500 women and 70 men were at the skating rink, Aldwych, on census night. And this was a report from the Census Office. For on the 28th of March 1911, John Burns, who was minister in charge of the census, had written to Churchill, who was then Home Secretary, asking the police in London to help enumerators in dealing with the proposed mass evasion in the Aldwych, explained that a rough enumeration of the persons gathering in the selected building is all that is desired. I may add that if this plan of countering the movement can be made a success, the necessity of prosecuting any large number of persons in default may be obviated, and the main object of the suffragists may thus be defeated. And there certainly were plenty of police around the Aldwych, because sometime after midnight they'd accompanied a large demonstration from Trafalgar Square along the Strand to outside the doors of the Rinkeries. And the police had to intervene to repel crowds of hooligans who were trying to get in and bust up the meeting. But Henry Nevinson, who's a WSBU supporter and journalist, and was reporting the night's events for Votes for Women, recorded that at nearly 3:30, Miss Christabel Pankhurst rose, and after we'd enjoyed her speech and the applause we gave her to the full, it seemed about supper time, then to the Gardenia next to Drury Lane. And this was a vegetarian restaurant in Catherine Street, just the other western end of Aldwych. And many of the 570 would then have been counted again there. I mean, Nevinson had already been counted in Hampstead, his home, so he was counted 3 times, so much for the statistics. For when we eventually found it, the census return for the Gardenia, and it's 200 women and 30 men, so quite a lot had gone along, including Nevinson. And in his evocative account of the night's events, what Nevinson didn't mention was the fact that John Burns's minions were standing by to count the boycotters. He says, "How big the completed audience was, even the census people might find it hard to estimate." Now, did the boycotters know that they were being counted, or was this Nevinson's comment in Votes for Women just bold spin? But by finding that census return, we've shown that whether or not the boycotters were aware of it, the census people did indeed have a firm estimate of their numbers. However, what they didn't have, and alas, nor do we, were the names and details of all those who took part.
Is everybody okay so far? Great. So we came across some expected boycotters. Henry Nevinson, Christabel Pankhurst, Emily Wilding Davidson. But we also came across some surprises. Suffragettes, who I'd mentioned earlier, come census night, decided to comply. There were really quite a few of these, and I just want to pick one example from the many. And I want to pick an example where I know a bit about the woman, so I can begin to perhaps piece together what might have been her reasoning on census night. And I've picked, just for this evening, Edith Key, who lived in Huddersfield in the West Riding, and she was, or at least had been, secretary of the WSBU Suffragette branch in Huddersfield, which had been an incredibly lively branch. And how do we know about this? Because, wonderfully, the minute book had survived in family hands and is now in the local archives, and I was able to read it. So we know from the minute book that the suffragettes of Huddersfield were a very feisty lot. A number of them went to prison. Edith Key herself, as branch secretary, didn't. She had 2 young sons. But what she did do as secretary is commend the prisoners for their, when they were in prison, she wrote to them, commend their strength and their womanly endurance. Their strength and their womanly endurance despite prison. And then we know from the oral testimony of her 2 sons later on that come the Cat and Mouse Act of 1913, Edith Key, in her smallish house in centre of Huddersfield, had rambling attics, conveniently rambling attics, and in those rambling attics she hid suffragette mice, fugitives from the cats. So before and after the census, we can put together a picture of Edith Key as a supporter of militancy. She was happy to support people breaking the law. So why did Edith, a businesswoman, not boycott on census night? And her census schedule is here if you'd like to have a look at it afterwards. She lived in a modest house on a modest income, wage, her and her husband. So was she deterred by the £5 fine? I don't know exactly how much her husband would earn, but it probably represented about 3 weeks' wages. So quite possibly a little bit of a deterrent. Or, and this relates to what Pat was talking about, was with the Women's Health campaign in Huddersfield a particular factor, because there was a very active local health visiting, etc., way of trying to improve women's health in that particular town. We'll never know, but Edith Key remains, along with all the other Huddersfield suffragettes, mysterious in their exact thinking, and I found it very difficult, no, impossible, to find a single boycotter in Huddersfield town, despite their very lively WSPU branch. And as Elizabeth has suggested, when we came up against this inconvenient, surprising, inconvenient new evidence, we decided to look again at some of the suffrage historiography. We went back to read things like Emmeline Pankhurst's My Own Story, because they had given us a distinct impression of how widespread was the suffragette boycott. And we felt we needed to go beyond that and look at some of the other factors, the wider historical context. And this again comes back to what Pat was talking about, because we uncovered some arguments, very strongly, stridently expressed arguments against the boycott. And no one expressed the opposition, the criticism of the boycott plan more strongly, more effectively, more succinctly than Michael Sadler. Who's Michael Sadler? And no one's here from Leeds or Manchester, are they? So Michael Sadler probably is not a new name. He was, at that point, Professor of History and Administration of Education at Manchester University. Well, that sounds dry and boring, doesn't it? History and Administration of Education, I mean, crikey. But what Sadler was a brilliant social reformer. He focused in on secondary education, and he asked, why was secondary education such a mess still, or quite a mess, in Britain? Well, there's only one place to go and find out, Germany. Lloyd George went to Germany to find out about how they did national insurance better, or at least did it, and Sadler went to Germany too to find out how they did secondary education. And he carried, like Lloyd George, a lot of clout, because he spoke from the heart of liberalism. He was a liberal through and through. And one of the things he believed in was that independent, authoritative research should be enshrined at the very heart of policy making. That policy making to improve women and children's health in the future should be based on accurate data. So when he heard that from the Women's Freedom League and suffragettes that they were going to boycott the census, he was incandescent. And what do you do if you're really furious? You write to the Times. He wrote to the Times immediately, 14th of February, 1911. And in his letter in the Times, he wrote, "To boycott the census would be a crime against science." He means a crime against social science. "For upon the completeness of the census returns depends future legislation to better the conditions of all people." And he ended his short letter, "To sulk against the census would not be a stroke of statesmanship, but a nursery fit of bad temper." The suffragettes were just infantile. This jibe was short, and it stung, and it reverberated. Its rival paper, the Manchester Guardian, C.P. Scott's Manchester Guardian, republished the letter, and it went round the suffragettes, who were furious and retaliated. And Edith Howe Martin for the Women's Freedom League, and herself a scientist, wrote back immediately in her letters in the Times 2 days later. And she retorted, "For women to comply with the census when governed without their consent would be a crime against the fundamental principles of liberty." Again, a crime against the fundamental principles of liberty. So Sadler, Howe Martin, these arguments flared the length and breadth of the country. They flared in the local newspapers. They flared in meeting halls. And they flared in different forms of language. They flared as a political argument, they flared as a moral argument, and they even flared as a religious argument. They flared in places like Sheffield, Halifax, but it wasn't just a north-south thing, and you might be getting the impression that maybe I've chosen my examples from Yorkshire and Elizabeth's chosen her example from London, though it may be something about that, but I think I'd like to suggest it wasn't black and white at all. And I'd just like to end with a couple of examples. Suffrage heartland of Kensington, Kensington High Street, not far from the Kensington High Street tube. There lived Clements and Lawrence Houseman, who provided uniquely the creative imagination for the boycott. And on census night, Lawrence opened his house to local suffragette invaders. Clements, more discreetly and quietly, got on a train down to Dorset and evaded down there. So I was particularly interested, we were particularly interested to look at the suffragettes living close by in that particular neck of the woods in Kensington. And there were half a dozen suffrage enthusiasts there, but apart from Lawrence, we couldn't find a single other boycotter. And let me just give one example, if I may, which is Ernestine Mills, the WSPU enamelist. She complied. Why? What persuaded her to comply? Was it because her doctor husband had bravely championed Lloyd George's health reforms? It can't have been the £5 fine. A doctor wouldn't sneeze much at a £5 fine. So what was it in Ernestine's mind at the time? I just want to end with some surprise boycotters, because one of the delights of doing this suffrage research is that they pop up where you're least expecting them. Who is this woman? What is this place? People we've almost scarcely know their names. And again, I pick a favourite almost at random from the many. But is anybody here from Berkshire? Oh, wonderful. Well, in Twyford, in Berkshire, Mrs. Scott of Hurst Nurseries, she was the only boycotter we found in Berkshire, and she was married to a market gardener, and she must have been a quite keen suffragette. She evaded with her mother-in-law, a female visitor, and herself, so 3 adult female evaders. And there's an angry statement written, as Elizabeth says, they write a defiant angle. None of you are following the lines. Defiant angle. If in doubt, do it obliquely. And the statement on this schedule says, all adult females omitted as a protest against the government's veto of the Women's Franchise Bill. And then in angry capital letters, women don't count. So once again, no votes, no census.
So in fact, though we haven't collaborated in this, it so happens that I've picked out a census form that I would particularly like to talk about, and there happens to be one in Kensington. And it's interesting because it's got a good story behind it in a way, but also the census resister was a doctor, a woman doctor. And women doctors on the whole were quite keen on boycotting the census. Many of them were members of the Women's Tax Resistance League. I mean, because they paid tax quite handsomely and no vote, they were, it was something they took to heart. Anyway, this is the form, I brought it along, it's just so you can see it's got quite a lot of writing on it. This is Dr. Flora Murray, who lived in a mansion flat on Camden Hill. And she'd been quite a long-standing member of the NUWSS, but with her companion and fellow doctor, Dr. Louisa Garrett Anderson, she'd moved on to the WSPU. She tried to sort of subvert the NUWS at an AGM, trying to get them to be more militant, and when this was 1910 or so, when they had stalled on this, she then moved to the WSPU. Anyway, on her form she wrote, I refuse to fill in this form as a protest against the action of the government which refuses to give parliamentary representation to women householders. And then the enumerator has written underneath, he says, Dr. Janet Murray, he gets confused with a Dr. Janet Campbell who shared the same address, refuses to give information, see attached letter. I have ascertained, however, that she was absent from the flat on the night of Sunday the 2nd of April, as also was one of the servants. One servant only, aged about 25. You know, they stood at the door and eyed them up, I think, to make some guess, because they were supposed to get as much information as possible. One servant only, aged about 25, occupied the flat that evening. He doesn't, of course, have any further details about the servant. The letter he mentions is still attached to the form and was duly digitised when the census was done. And it's a letter on a headed notepaper from Flora Murray, and she wrote, "Please do not come to my door and worry or question my maid. Any questions which you have to ask must be addressed to me as the occupier. If you wish to see me, call on Wednesday at 11 a.m. And thus spoke the woman professional. There's no evidence the enumerator troubled her further. Flora Murray may well have spent census night at the Aldwych skating rink, or she may have joined one of the much smaller census parties. There was one that was held by the Brackenbury family in the house that later became known as Mouse Castle on Camden, in Camden Square, Camden Hill Square. And in Vanishing for the Vote's gazetteer, it tells hundreds of such stories. And though with a rather imperious note to the enumerator, Flora Murray was, one would think, inviting prosecution, indeed giving a time and place for when a summons might be delivered. As we know, the government didn't act on their threats. Whatever the reality of the extent of the boycott census, the suffragettes were able to claim victory. For the headline to Nevison's article, the one that I quoted from Votes for Women earlier, was complete success of census protest. Mr. John Burns gives in, no prosecutions to be undertaken.
Right, so what did the government learn from the census? They were convinced that the resistance had been too insignificant to affect the findings. So what did those intrusive questions reveal? Actually, not a lot at the time, because it took even longer then than now to analyse a whole census, and the First World War intervened. An interim report was published in 1917, but a full one not till 1923. And by then, a lot had changed. During the war, of course, many young men were killed, making it all the more urgent to keep babies alive and help them grow into the next generation of healthy adults. Again, potential recruits to the army were ejected because they were unfit, which added to the panic about the physical state of the nation. The birth rate was still falling, and there were investigations into why, but no one could explain it. Still less think of ways to encourage women to have more babies once they'd learned how to avoid the endless cycle of pregnancy, birth, stillbirth, child rearing, child death. That was the alternative. And campaigning women took advantage of the intensified wartime panic to campaign still harder for improved maternal and child welfare services. And the government responded from just before the war, was increasingly subsidising and encouraging local authorities to provide health and welfare services for mothers and children. Then in 1918, shortly after the end of the war, it introduced the Maternity and Child Welfare Act, which took it further, provided subsidies to local authorities to set up free welfare clinics, appoint health visitors and home helps, build maternity hospitals. It was up to local authorities to take advantage of this. So women's groups turned to putting pressure on them to do so, and more local authorities did in the 1920s and 30s, particularly as more of them became Labour controlled. And the infant mortality rate did fall quite sharply between the wars. And the health of working class children improved, though least in the areas of high unemployment. But there were improvements. So the 1911 census didn't affect policy directly and policy change, but not because of the findings of the census. But it is fascinating for historians for what it reveals about the families. And to give another example, there's one here that's almost impossible to read, but to tell you what's in it. In this case, the head of the household is a woman, described as the head. She's Frances Sterling, aged 51, who describes herself as being married for 26 years. Now, there's no sign of her husband, and she describes herself as the head, and if there was a husband around, he would normally be the head. So it's a bit hard to know what was going on. And she doesn't describe herself as widow. The census only allowed people to describe themselves as married or widowed or single. There were no other options. You couldn't say you were divorced or separated, even though quite a lot of people were divorced, and even more separated, because divorce at this time is expensive and difficult, and particularly for women. But you couldn't, so that kind of thing is something else that's hidden in the census. So we don't know what Frances Sterling's actual status was. She described herself as a suffragette, that was her occupation, of private means. And she lived in a 10-roomed house, the census asked that too, in Cheltenham. She clearly wasn't badly off. She'd had 7 children, of whom 2 had died. So here was a middle-class woman who had a lot of children, and 2 of them had died. 3 of her daughters lived with her. Elvira, aged 24, described as single. Her occupation was women's suffrage. She worked for the WSPU. Then 18-year-old Ethel was also single with no occupation given, and 14-year-old Nina was at school. And they had, of course, a living-in servant who was a 59-year-old widow. So despite so clearly stating her allegiance to the suffragette cause, Frances had filled out the census. Again, we've no idea why. She wrote across the form, "This form is filled in through the magnanimity of a suffragette, hoping that a more generous and just legislation for women will soon be forthcoming from those in power in Great Britain." So she chose to make a statement rather than boycotting it, but why she made this choice, we just don't know. It's only quite recently that historians have been able to get at the census data and analyse what it actually did show. And they found there wasn't, after all, a simple class pattern to births or deaths, but very interesting regional differences affecting all classes. For example, in areas with plenty of work for working class married women, like the northern textile towns, working class families had fewer children, and they obviously made the calculation they'd rather have a higher income from the woman going out to work, since the opportunity was there. In mining districts where there was almost no work for women, the birth rate was the highest of all. In heavily middle-class areas of the south, all classes tended to have lower birth rates. Religion mattered. Among Roman Catholics, all classes had more children. And child death rates were highest among the poorest generally, but they were particularly low among poor Jewish immigrants in East London and elsewhere, who paid particularly close attention to hygiene. So this is just a brief survey of some of the curious differences that the analysis showed. And it's not clear that it would have provided a very clear guidance to government policymakers had they had it available. The analysis showed that income mattered, but it wasn't the only influence on birth and death rates. We know this now, but this knowledge came too late to guide policy after 1911. Instead, governments from the war onwards took the sensible course of trying to improve the national health by relieving poverty and providing improved free health care to poor families, urged on all the way by the newly enfranchised women who, having got their vote, used it to campaign for improvements of this kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Well, you've had an awful lot to listen to, three of us, and our aim has been to prime the conversation, and we've very much structured this is our intention, as something of an argument that there's at least two ways of looking at this. After census night, both sides claimed victory. The suffragettes certainly did, as Elizabeth indicated, saw it as a complete victory, that John Burns climbed down in the night and announced there were no fines and no court cases. And the government claimed victory because of the millions of women in England, and Elizabeth and I have only been able to look at England. The vast, vast, vast majority of people were counted, and those who slipped through the net, John Burns felt was absolutely, and his civil servants, was absolutely tiny. In terms of publicity, the suffragettes, in the days immediately after the census night, did grab the headlines. In Vanishing for the Vote, I've included the front page of Tuesdays, the census on Sunday, on Tuesdays, front page of the Daily Sketch shows caravans on Wimbledon Common, and about 3 caravans camping overnight, very dark on Wimbledon Common, very chilly, and 10 rather chilly evaders, and they captured the front pages of particularly the popular press, which was then of increasing importance. And in January 2009, when the census schedules, as Elizabeth described, began to be released, it was the suffragettes, along with the looming First World War, that really commanded the newspapers' attentions. So what we've hoped to do is to show you something of the battle for the census, the arguments for the census, that went to and fro in spring 1911, and maybe help shape individual suffragettes and disenfranchised women all on census night as to what they could do, what they would do. And we could see there are sets of arguments emerging for health and welfare reform, for which census data was essential, as Pat has indicated, or for women's citizenship, no vote, no census, as Elizabeth has described. There were arguments about democracy. Was it democracy for people, welfare, provision, for people, or was it democracy by people, for which you really needed the vote? Which came first, political rights, the right to vote, to elect your own MP, or political duties, the duty of a citizen to supply the government with what they needed? And on census night, 2nd of April 1911, what would you have done? It was a close call. So on that note, I hope we've primed the conversation, and if there are questions, comments, please do just put your hand up.